Hello there everybody, welcome back to another video, and in today's video we are going to set up NextAuth with the credentials provider in Next.js. So essentially you'll be able to add authentication in your Next.js app with username and password. Now we are going to be using the NextAuth library in this case, and as per my experience I have faced a lot of troubles adding the credentials provider, which means adding authentication using username and password. So this video is going to help you out with that. All right, so the very first step is to create a Next.js app. So I'm just going to go ahead and say npx create next app. So let's do that, next app, and I'm just going to say dot, and then I'm just going to add the --ts to use TypeScript. You can still use JavaScript, it's fine, but I'm going to be using TypeScript and the code won't be very different, so you don't need to worry about that. We are also going to be using Prisma, which is an ORM for relational databases, and MongoDB as well. So we are going to be using Prisma. If you use some other database provider, then you can still use something else. If you use a different ORM, you can still use that with NextAuth. It provides a huge support for these other ORMs as well. Alright, so once our app is initialized, now let's set up Prisma. If you don't want to see how Prisma is set up and all that stuff, you can skip to this time step above, and let's do that now. So first off, we are going to npm install Prisma with the dash uppercase D flag. Now that Prisma is installed as a dev dependency, we are also going to install the Prisma/client. After that is done, we are going to install the Prisma adapter for NextAuth, which is also required. So let's do that final little thing. Npm install NextAuth Prisma adapter. Now let's go ahead and say npx prisma init, which will initialize Prisma for us, and it's going to create a .env file which we should not commit to git. So let's just go ahead and add this to our git ignore real quick. That's it. Let's remove all these comments, and in the database URL I'm just going to say file :/db dot let's just say test.db. Really doesn't matter because we are using SQLite right over here just for this demo. Once we have that, let's go inside of this Prisma schema where we have, let's change this provider to SQLite, and now let's add these tables. So if you go to this page, I'll put this link in the description below, you'll find a lot of details about this. So we'll just go ahead and copy these models that we need for this to work, right? So we could just go ahead and say model account. I guess that's all we need. And now we could just go ahead and paste this. Now we have to make a few changes because we are not using, we are using SQLite, so we don't need db text. Let's get rid of that, and also these little things, let's remove these, and that's all. Now one thing that we have to change is in the user model right over here in the users table, instead of having an email, we are going to have a username, right? And you can also have the email verified, it really doesn't matter. So we're going to add the username, and additionally let's add a password which will be a string, and username is not going to be optional. That's all we have right over here. Now let's go ahead and run npx prisma migrate dev so that we have all these tables created. I'm just going to say init, that will be the name of our migration, and if you see, there's our db. Now let's go ahead and install NextAuth. So what we will need in here is npm install NextAuth. Then we are going to need two more dependencies. So that is, first one is Zod and the other one is bcrypt.js. This is for our schema validation. So when someone sends a request to our API, we can validate that. And bcrypt.js is simply a library so that we can hash our password. So let's do that. Since we are using TypeScript, we will also need to install at types/bcrypt.js as a dev dependency. So let's do that again. Now let's go ahead and create a register route, because NextAuth is not going to handle our registration function. So basically when the user signs up, NextAuth is going to handle the login functionality, where it's going to have a JWT token that it returns, and it's going to store that in the Next.js app and all that stuff, so that we don't have to worry about it. What we can do is we could go inside of the pages API directory, and let's create a folder, not a folder, but actually a file called register.ts. And inside of this register.ts file, let's actually write the code for our backend for a registration. What we could do is we could just export default an asynchronous function, and we're going to call it register user. Let's just do that. and this is going to take in the request, which will be next API request. Now again, if you're using JavaScript and not TypeScript, you can skip this part easily. Then we have the response, which will be next API response, as simple as that. Now when the user registers, we need two things from them: the username they choose and the password they choose. So what we can do is we install a dependency called Zod, and with Zod we can validate if the user sends us the correct data or not. So what we are going to do is we're going to create a register user schema. Now if you don't know what Zod is, just follow along with me. So what we can do is we are going to just say Z, and that will be imported from Zod right there, z dot object, and call it as a function. And then inside of their first property is going to be the username, and that is going to be z dot string, not strict object, string. And what we could do is we can sort of make it a username. So this is a pretty cool website I really like, called I Hate Regex, where you can find it regular expressions for your app. So I'm just going to copy this regular expression for username. After copying the username regular expression, we could just go ahead and chain this regex method, and here we will need a regular expression. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste this in within these slashes, and I'm going to add gm for global and multi-line. We don't need multi-line. And then in here we could add the error message, which is going to be username invalid, or let's just say invalid username. Next up, we are going to add the password. So let's add a comma and let's say password. That is also going to be a z dot string, and also we're going to add a min of 1, which means it should have a minimum length of 1. Actually, it should have a minimum length of 5 because it's a password, right? And let's also go ahead and add the error message. So password should be minimum 5 characters. Back in the register user function, what we can do is we could just go ahead and say const something is equal to register user schema, the variable we created above, dot parse, and we can parse whatever the data comes from the user, which is request dot data. Let's do that, request dot data. Actually, it's request dot body, my bad. So this will be the body that user sends us through the post request. So once we have that, we have the username and the password properly parsed. I'm just going to collapse that, and let's go ahead and say const prisma equals to new prisma client, which will basically allow us to create prisma queries. All right, now that we have prisma right over here, what we can do is we could check if the user already exists, and we can do that by simply, let's just say const user is going to be await prisma dot user dot find, and I'll just say find unique in this case, and we'll say where username is going to be equal to the username. So if you don't provide the key and the value, you can just provide one thing, which is basically this refers to this. So where username, and this will be either the user or null. So what we can do is we could say if user is, well, not equal to null, what we can do is we could just go ahead and return, let's say return res.send, and we can send back user null and message user already exists. All right, so once that check is done, let's go ahead and create the user. So basically, if the user is not null, we are going to return that user is, or user already exists. Next, creating a user. So I'll just say const new user. New user is going to be equal to await prisma dot user dot create, and then we can create a new user by passing it in the data. So the data is going to be the username and the password. But what we don't want is that the password should be hashed. We don't want to just send the password right away. So what we can do is we could just go up top right over here, and we could say const hashed password is going to be equal to bcrypt dot hash. Now this is what we have to import manually. I don't know, it does not work this way, so I'm going to import bcrypt from the library called bcrypt.js. Remember, that's the different name. And then inside of hash, we have to pass in two arguments. First is the password that we want to hash, which is basically password, and the next is the salt. So by default it's 10. I'm also giving it the number 10, and the password is going to be hashed password that we get back from right over here. And the problem is that this will return hash will return a promise of string, which means we have to await this first. Once we have the new user created, let's just go ahead and return res.send. The user is going to be equal to new user, and let's add the message that user created successfully. All right, that's it. That's all we need for this basic implementation. You can take this forward because this is just a bare bones implementation of the register function. Now let's work on authentication. So inside of the NextAuth docs, you'll see we have to create an auth folder, and inside of the auth folder, we have to create this file with this name. So with these brackets and dots, let me just copy this part. Coming back to VS Code in the API folder, I'm going to create a new file. Actually, wait, in the API folder, create a new file, and then just add .ts after that. So it's going to be auth. Inside of the auth folder is going to be nextauth.ts. Now this file is going to be longer than we think. First, let's go ahead and create a variable called auth options. So I'm just going to auth options. This will have a type of auth options that comes from NextAuth, and it's going to be an object. Now what we could do is we could export default next auth. This is a function that comes from NextAuth again, and we have to pass in the auth options right over here. Now inside of this auth options, we are going to first off add the Prisma adapter that we installed previously. So what I can do is I could just say adapter is going to be Prisma adapter, and right over here what I can do is I could just go ahead and say const Prisma equals to new Prisma client. So we just go ahead and create a new Prisma client, and then we just pass it right inside of the adapter. Then we can go down and we can add the credentials provider, basically the provider that we want to use, and that's called the credentials provider. So I'm just going to add an array called providers. So this is going to be an array where you have to add credentials. So if you write credentials, it will automatically import it, but let's change this with F2, and I'm going to make it credentials provider so that it's more clear. Now again, this is a function. Inside of here we have these options. Now these options are pretty simple, but we have to work quite a bit. So the first step is adding the credentials. What do we need from the user? So if I go ahead and let's go inside the object, we will need the credentials, and this again another object with a username. So the first step is going to be the username, and if I just go ahead and open up another object, it's going to have a type and a placeholder and a value. So I'm just going to give it the type of text, which basically means an input type text, and then we could just go ahead and give it a placeholder for, well, test@test.com. okay, and then we could just copy and paste the same thing, but this is going to be password now, and this is going to be the type of password, and it's going to have a placeholder of, let's just say, password something like this. Really doesn't matter. Once we have the credentials set up, what we can do is we could just go ahead and add a method called authorize. So this is the authorize method, and what we have to do is, for now, just to remove the errors, I'm going to return null. So this authorize method will return either null or the user back. So what we need is, we first want to make it asynchronous. Let's make it async. So it will return null when the user does not exist or the authorization failed for some reason, and it will return the user object itself when the authorization passes, right? So basically you return null if the user does not exist or the password is wrong or something like that. Now, as we did in the register page, if I go back, this register user schema, we can do the same thing with the login schema. So let's go right over here, and I'm going to paste this, and this is going to be login user schema, and let's just import z from zod. And then what we can do is we can parse the same way we did inside of the register function right over here. So what we can do is, let's just go ahead and say const something is equal to login user schema dot parse, and we want to pass in the request dot body. Actually, instead of doing request dot body, we have the credentials object right over here, which you can simply pass in right over here. So we get back a username and a password. Now once we have done that, let's see if the user exists or not. So what we can do is we can again bring in Prisma. So const user is going to be await Prisma that we already initialized right over here. So Prisma dot user dot find unique. So we can find unique where the username is equal to the username, as simple as that. So we are finding the user by the username, not by the password, because this password will not be hashed, and in the database we are storing hashed passwords. So this is again going to be either user or it's going to be null. So what we can do is we could check, well, hey, if not user, then return null, which means the user does not exist. So we return null and you're not logged in. Back in here, what we can do is we could go ahead and check if the password is right or not. So the username is right, but the password is right or not. And we can do that again with bcrypt. So let's go to the top, and I'm going to just go ahead and say import bcrypt from bcrypt.js. Then let's go down there right over here, and I'm going to say const is password valid, like so. That's going to be equal to await bcrypt.compare. Now here we compare, and if you look closely, this is s and hash. So s basically means what the user provides us, and hash is the password that we have in the database. So s, which means the password that we receive from the user, and then hash is going to be user dot password, which is basically this is the database password, right? This is the hashed version of it. So this is going to give us a boolean value, and what we can do is we could again check if not is password valid. We can again return null, which means the password is not valid, you're still not logged in. And finally, if everything is done, what we can do is we can return back the user. So this is essentially the authorize function, which you have to write on your own. Now, the other thing that we have to add is the thing called callbacks. So I'm just going to collapse the credentials provider, and coming out of the providers array, you can add a property called callbacks, which will be basically called after some code runs. So the first callback we are going to add is called session. So if I just write session, you see this is how it works. Now in session, we get back, if I just expand this, we have the session, basically the session of the user, and the token. So whenever the user tries to get the session, right, whenever we try to write in our code that if the user exists or not, what we can do is we could go ahead and say session dot user dot id to the token dot id. Now it might give you some type errors right now, but ignore it, and then we can return back this session. So all we are doing essentially is just adding an id property on the user so that we can access this id on the front end where we try to get the user. Once this part is done, let's again do this. Let's add one more callback, which will be called JWT. So in the JWT callback, we are going to get the token, the account, and the user. So basically, when we append this ID to the token, we can append this ID to the user in the session, right? And we can basically make a check. So if account exists, right? So if the user is created, we set the token dot access token, that will be equal to account dot access underscore token, and then token dot id will be equal to user dot id. And then finally we are going to return back the token. Now this return token will come over here and give us the ID inside of the session. Now let's see how we can fix this type error. So right over here in the root, I'm going to add a next-auth.d.ts. Now do this only if you are using TypeScript. If you're using JavaScript, you don't need to worry about it. First off, you're going to import NextAuth from NextAuth, not like this. Instead, we have to import it from the NextAuth package. So let's make it proper. And then we can declare module NextAuth, and we are going to just change the interface called session. So all we are doing is we are modifying the types internally in the NextAuth. And what we do is we just say user is going to have an ID of string, and so you add an ampersand and you can say session index user. So basically you say, well, hey, user is also going to have an ID with the default user properties that it has, and that takes out the type error. All right, so now the callbacks part is done as well. Let's go below and we are going to add the pages. So basically we want to tell NextAuth that the sign in page. So basically the sign in page will be /login, which is the page we are going to use where our user will log in. So we don't want to use NextAuth's page, we want to create our own page. Then we could go ahead and add session. Inside of the session object, we can add the strategy of JWT. So what this basically means is that it's going to return a JSON web token that will be stored in the cookies and all that stuff. Finally, we have to add a secret. So let's just do secret, and this is going to be process.env dot I'm just going to call it JWT secret. It really does not matter. So let's just copy this, and I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add this JWT secret as some random gibberish. Make sure to make it random and not to expose it. So now we are done with this file completely. Let's get rid of it. Now let's work on the actual UI. So I'm going to just kickstart the dev server npm run dev with the turbo flag so that it starts up easily. This is how the page looks like. Okay, so I quickly went ahead and added the login page and register page. So if you just go ahead and say register here, you will go to the register page or the login page. And also, if you want to do this yourself, you could just go ahead and do this yourself. But I have the code on the GitHub repository, which will be linked down below, from where you can just copy all of the CSS code and all that stuff. Coming back to the register page, which is the first functionality we have to do. So what we can do is when the form is submitted, we can basically submit this form with these data. Now I'm just going to go ahead and create a function for submission. So function on, actually let's just call this handle submit, and this will take the event in itself, which will be form event. Right now what we can do is we could just go ahead and chain this. On submit is going to be equal to handle submit. Now inside of here, first off, we are going to get these input types. So this input has a name of username and this one has a name of password. So what we can do is we could just go ahead and say const something is equal to new form data, and this form data in itself will take the e.target. So we could say as is going to be HTML form element. Now if you're using JavaScript, don't add these type annotations, this one or this one. Will be fine with without these. And over here we could just say, well, we get back the form. And now let's see how we can push to this API. So we have created this API/register file. What we could do is, let's close this out. So we are going to do something like this. Let's make this asynchronous first, and then what we can do is we could say fetch. Now fetch is going to take in the route, which is going to be /API/register, and then what we can do is we could pass in the other data. Now the first off, we are going to say the method is going to be post. So method is going to be post, and then we could say headers, and inside of the headers we can pass in the content type. This will be equal to application/JSON, as simple as that. Then we could go down and set the body to JSON.stringify, and this is basic JavaScript, right? This is not something that I need to explain you right now. So it's going to JSON stringify, and we could pass in the two things that we need to pass in, which is first off is the username. So username is going to be form.get, and we could get the username this way, username, and then password is going to be the same thing. So we could say form.get password. All right, as simple as that. Now what we can do is we could get back the response. Let's await fetch. So we get back the response. Then what we can do is we could say const data is going to be await res.json. So convert the response to JSON data. And then what we can do is finally we can, if you go back to the register route, here we return a user, right? Here we return a user as the new user. So what we can essentially check is if data.user is not equal to null, or we could simply go ahead and say if not data.user. So if the user does not exist, right, from our response, we could return null in this case. Essentially what you can do is you can show a message that the password is invalid or the user already exists. In this case, the user will already exist. But right now we'll skip that part. You can do that yourself. Now once all that is done, once we check if the user exists or not, so the user exists, the user is registered. Now we want to log the user in. So what we can do is we could just import something from NextAuth/React, and we can import the sign in function. And after all this operation is done, we could just call the sign in function. Let's do that, sign in. And inside of sign in, we can first of all specify we want the credentials to be used, and then we can add a comma, and we could say, well, hey, first off, the username is going to be data dot user dot username. The password will be data dot user dot password. And basically we don't want to authenticate with the password like that, so let's just go ahead and say password is going to be form dot get, and we get the password. And what we can do then is we can add a callback URL, which is after this stuff is done, we can redirect the user to the slash route. And essentially that's it. If you want some more operations to do after sign in, what you can do is you could just await this and then do the other operations. Let's test this out if it works or not. So right over here, I'm on the app. Instead of the login page, let's go to register, and I'm going to just go ahead and say, well, hey, the username is going to be my name, Usman, and the password is going to be Usman1234. Let's also open up the dev tools so that we can see if it actually works or not. So I'm going to go to the network tab and let's click on submit.
Wait a minute.
I forgot one thing to do before we submit. So basically when we submit a form, the page refreshes by default. So we have to prevent that behavior. So I could just go ahead and call e.prevent default at first. Okay, coming back, let's click on submit now, and you see it goes ahead, redirects us to the home page. Now if I go back inside of here, let's launch a new terminal and let's say npx Prisma Studio to open up our Prisma Studio. So in here, if we can just see, we have the user table, and inside of the user table we have the username, we have the password which is completely hashed, and I guess that's all. So now we are redirected to the home page, but how do we check if the user exists or not? So let's go to the home page, which is the index.tsx, and I am just going to remove everything from in here. So let's do that real quick, and let's get rid of these ones as well. And what we can do is we could just right now let's return a div and an h2 welcome, and then what we can do is let's also have a p tag, so user id. Right now what we are going to do is let's just go ahead and say const something is equal to use session. So use session comes from NextAuth React, and we get back a couple of data. So we get back the data, and then we get back the status. So what we can basically check is if the status is authenticated, then, and we can also say, well, hey, if you go back, you see it's session or null. So if data is not equal to null again, then we can display this data right over here, which we need to wrap in a parent element like so. So we could say welcome, and then we could say data dot user dot username, and then right over here we could say data dot user dot id for now, and let's hit save. Let's go back to the app. It says use session must be wrapped in a session provider. So we forgot one thing. If I go to the underscore app.tsx, this is what we have to wrap inside the session provider so that we can access the session. So let's cut this out, and I'm going to add a session provider, and let's just wrap it this like this. Hit save, go back, you see welcome, and then we get back nothing, and the user ID is this. Now if I were to just go ahead and see why the username does not work, let's just go ahead and do a little trick. So I'm just going to say json.stringify the data.user. You see we get back the name null, image is null, and the ID is this. So if you want to access the username, we can do the same thing that we did with the ID. So come back right over here in the type definitions, and I'm just going to add username string, and then what we can do is go back to our NextAuth file, and right over here we could just go ahead and add these things. So in the callbacks, when the session is requested, we could say session dot user dot username is going to be equal to token dot, well, we have some stuff, so token dot username, and then token dot username right over here is going to be equal to user dot username. Let's hope it works. I know it says, it gives us an error, and that is because we have to simply log out and log in again. So right now what I'm going to do is go to the dev tools inside of the, let's see, in the application tab, in the cookies, I'm just going to clear all these cookies so that now we are not logged in. And what we can do is go back to the login page. Now let's implement the login page because this is going to work once we log in. In the login page, everything is going to be the exact same thing as we did in the register page. So let's copy the handle submit and let's paste it. And let's just go to the form. Let's say on submit is going to be handle submit. The only different thing is going to be we don't need this fetch request. So let's get rid of that. And all we need is just this sign in. So we can await it if we want, but we can also skip it. So this is going to be form dot get, and we get back the username. All right, so a form event is also not imported. Let's do that. Come back to the login page. Let's see if it actually works. So my username was Usman and my password was Usman1234, I believe. And when I click on submit, you see we are redirected to the home page, and now we get the username. The only thing left to fix is that it says property username does not exist on user or adapter user. This is an sort of an internal error. So right now, to fix this, for a temporary solution, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap this inside of these parentheses, and I'm going to say as a user, and this user comes from Prisma client. So let's import that. So now this is the user type in Prisma client, and as user, then we can access the username. We know that it works fine. And if I go to this terminal where I console log the user, you see we get back the ID, we get back the username, we get back the password. Essentially, whatever we return from this authorize function, we get everything right over here. Alright, that's it for this video. I hope you liked it. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was insightful. And please let me know in the comments below if you want more videos like these on Next.js, on Prisma, on NextAuth, something stuff like that. I'm pretty excited to bring you a lot more content like this. Hope you liked this one. Peace out.